everybody. So this is going to be the video lecture in lieu of class on Friday, the 17th of November. I will put up in Moodle an assignment for you to do that's in response to this video lecture. It's not anything crazy. It's basically just my way of verifying that you listened to the video lecture, that you took something away from the video lecture, and it's also how I will count you present or absent for that day, since we're not physically meeting, nor are we meeting over Zoom. So basically, I just need you to listen to this lecture, and then once you've listened to the lecture, go back and complete the assignment that's up in Moodle. Again, it's not going to be a difficult assignment, just something to verify that you have actually listened to the lecture. So, and let me just say a preface before we get into this. You may hear my very old and very lethargic cat in the background at some point. She's rather loud. She's mostly deaf, and I think she can't hear herself, so she's rather loud. So if you hear something that sounds like an animal dying, it's just my cat. She's perfectly fine, I promise you. She's just very old, and she likes to talk, so you may hear her come in and talk. So I apologize for that, but I have no way of stopping her. So anyway, if you hear strange sounds, just my cat. There she is. Kiki. She's, like I said, she's mostly deaf, so she can't hear herself, and she can be rather loud. Come here. Yes, hello. Yes. Okay, I'm gonna put her up here, and then maybe she will not make so much noise. Okay, hey, find a spot, all right? Okay. So let's get into it. All right, today we're gonna be talking about what are called logical fallacies. It's good to have an awareness of logical fallacies and what they are. I do not necessarily want you to walk away from this video having memorized the names of all of these fallacies, and we're not going through every single logical fallacy that exists, but we're going through a number of the more common ones that you tend to see. I'm not so much interested in you knowing by heart the names of these fallacies or even their definitions. But rather, I want you to have an awareness of them and to be able to think about them when you're writing, especially when we're doing the kind of writing that we're doing right now that's argumentative in nature, because logical fallacies make your writing weaker. So just to start out, a logical fallacy, in terms of defining what a logical fallacy is, a logical fallacy is when you commit a type of logic that is not very sound or not very well reasoned. So logical fallacies occur when you are using a fallacy in such a way as to direct the conversation into a different direction, or to throw the conversation off track, or you're using a type of logic that is not a good type of logic for one reason or another. I wanted to talk about this especially after we had covered, if you were in class on Wednesday, we had covered that paper about the student trying to convince people to be vegetarian. There were a number of logical fallacies in that paper. We talked about that a little bit in class. The students' sort of insistence on saying things like vegetarians are attacking people who eat meat, or making these statements about how meat has existed since the beginning of time, or that people have existed for billions of years. Like those are examples of where the logic of the student is not sound. It's not very good logic. It's not logic that is backed up in facts and in things that are verifiable. So fallacies then are just that. They're faults. They're faults in your logic. And I want to talk about these just as a way of sort of giving you some examples of things to stay away from. Again, not so much interested in you knowing the name of every single fallacy that I'm going to talk about. Chances are pretty good that you've heard of a couple of these before, but I'm more concerned with you understanding how that logic. First of all, that logical fallacies exist, and second of all, that they should be avoided. And just to give you some examples of what they are and why they're problematic. So let's dive right on in. I have some notes here. Let me pull up my notes. Okay, so the first fallacy we're going to be talking about is the ad hominem fallacy. Ad hominem is Latin, it just means against the man. This fallacy is when you personally attack someone rather than talking about whatever the topic is at hand. You see politicians do this a lot. This probably has also happened in your personal life where you've been in an argument with somebody and they have attacked your character, or they've called you a name, or they have otherwise gotten away from the conversation itself, from the argument itself, and instead of focusing on the argument, they're focusing on the person, and they're coming after that person personally. So an example of this would be that, say you're having a discussion about wanting the minimum wage to be better so that workers are protected, right? Say you're making this argument that minimum wage should go up so that workers are protected, and the person responds that the only reason you want minimum wage to go up is because you don't have any marketable skills. Right, so that's irrelevant to a conversation about minimum wage being a protection of workers. That's a person going and looking at you and saying, here's a fault or a perceived fault. I am of the opinion there's no such thing as unskilled labor. That's neither here nor there. But that's the person coming to something personally about you and saying, oh, that's not the real reason that you care about this argument. It's because of you not having marketable skills, or because you don't have an education, or because you don't have blah, blah, blah. So it's a personal attack on a person's character rather than talking about the issue at hand, which in this case would have been the minimum wage and protecting workers. Another example of that would be that if you were to come to someone, and this happened to a friend of mine actually, a professor that we shared told a friend of mine once that no one took her seriously because she enjoyed children's books. Again, that's an attack on a person that's not based in truth in any way, because you can get a PhD and specialize in children's books. I know people who have done it. And so when you're going after someone for something about them, something that they like, some aspect of their life, rather than whatever the issue is at hand, right? That's an ad hominem. It's a personal attack on a person that is not relevant to the conversation, to the larger point being made. This goes back to that paper that we were talking about on Wednesday, where the student was saying things like, vegetarians pick on people who eat meat, which is not true, right? That it doesn't exist. And in fact, the student was sort of doing the same thing to vegetarians by making these generalized statements, making these assumptions about how they must eat junk food, or they must be unhealthy because they don't get enough protein, or they must be this or that or the other. So that's like a personal attack on someone based on some aspect of who they are, or what they enjoy, or what their life looks like. This can also be a lot more, that's my other cat. This can also be a lot more of a problematic thing in terms of name calling, especially if you're talking about things like racial slurs or, stuff like that. So anytime that a person is attacking something or someone rather, or a demographic of people, rather than talking about whatever the issue is at hand, you've got an ad hominem fallacy happening. Because the fallacy there, the logical fallacy is, what does that person as an individual not having labor skills have to do with minimum wage protecting workers in general? It doesn't have anything to do with it. And the other reason that this fallacy is very problematic is because it's indicative of the fact that the person who is doing the attacking has run out of other viable, logical points to make, in which they can say, no, you're wrong, and you're wrong because I have evidence to show how you're wrong, rather than saying, no, you're wrong because you're a bad person, or you're wrong because you believe that gay people should get married, or just weird stuff like that. It's a personal attack on the person, their character, their beliefs, etc. So want to avoid that, definitely. Okay, next fallacy is called the false cause fallacy. So this fallacy occurs when the cause of a particular situation is incorrectly attributed to something. This is one that I know you guys have heard of, just probably not by name. One of the most common false cause fallacies, pardon me, is the belief that like an object is lucky and therefore it affects the outcome of something. So, like for example, my husband has lucky scarves for various sports teams that he supports that he like puts up over the TV when they're playing. And it's not that he truly believes that the scarves actually have an effect on the outcome of the game, but that's what the false cause fallacy is. It's holding a belief that one thing has caused the outcome of something else, when there's just no way that could be possible, right? Whether or not my husband puts a scarf on the TV stand is not going to change the outcome of a game one way or another. And I've seen that firsthand because sometimes his teams win and sometimes his teams lose. A more serious example of this would be someone who claims that all violent behavior by teenagers is because of video games. It's just not true. There's no causal factor there. Studies have been done that have indicated that it's just simply not true. It may be true for a couple of individual people, but generally speaking, to say an entire demographic of people become violent simply because they play video games is just simply not true. That's a causal fallacy. Or a false cause fallacy, rather. Okay, the next one is called the straw man fallacy. So the straw man fallacy happens when someone distorts or exaggerates another person's argument and then attacks that distortion or that exaggeration. So an example of this would be, say that you have someone who is pro-life and they make a statement like, women who want access to abortion women who want access to abortion care, like the access to be able to have an abortion, only want to kill babies, and killing babies should be illegal. That's taking something that is one thing, and abortion is not the same thing as killing a baby, and conflating it into this big exaggerated thing, and then attacking the big exaggerating thing that you just conflated it to. So going after, you're going away from whatever the main argument is, you're blowing the main argument up into this thing that it's not, and then rather than attacking the main argument, you're attacking this thing that you've just created. Again, you see this a lot with politicians. You see a lot of these a lot with politicians. You'll hear me say that often. A similar example would be that, say that you're making the claim that better pedestrian safety needs to be happening in Lafayette. I would make that claim. Because cars are dangerous, because people don't pay attention when they're operating cars, and therefore cars become dangerous. Then a person might look at you and say, well, if you think cars are dangerous, so you must be saying that we should ban all cars, and that's just absurd. And it's like, that's not what I was saying. I wasn't saying we should ban all cars. I was saying we should have greater measures to protect pedestrians because cars are dangerous, which is inherently true. But then you're conflating what I'm saying into me saying that I want all cars to be banned when that's never what I said in the first place, and now you're attacking that. So it's taking a situation, blowing it up into something that it's not, and then attacking the thing that has just been created that was not the argument in the first place. That's the straw man fallacy. You're setting up a straw man. You're setting up something that would be easy to knock over. That's why it's called the straw man. It's built of straw. You build it up really quickly, and then you knock it right back over. And that's a logical fallacy because you're not attacking what the actual root of the conversation was, what the actual argument was in the first place. Okay, the next one is the slippery slope fallacy. I know you've heard the term slippery slope before. So this fallacy occurs when a series of negative events are attached to a simple idea or suggestion, which often leads to these devastating outcomes or extreme conclusions. So it's taking one particular thing and then going on this like, oh wow, everything terrible is going to happen because of this one thing, and it ends drastically in these horrible ways, in these negative ways. This happens oftentimes with overthinkers, and I'm not criticizing overthinkers, I'm simply saying that for people who overthink, it can be very easy to take something that's relatively small and make the consequences of that particular thing just ginormous, just make them very very conflated. So for example, especially when I'm thinking about like overthinker, a student might conflate the idea that because they have an exam coming up and they're nervous about that exam, they might convince themselves that if they fail that exam, that their entire life is going to be ruined. That's a slippery slope. You're going from one small thing, which is failing a singular exam, to the conclusion that your whole life is going to be ruined, which is just simply not true, right? Your life is probably temporarily not going to be fantastic. You're probably not going to feel great if you fail an exam. Maybe you're going to fail a class. Maybe that's going to lead to, you know, some problems within your family or some issues with your GPA or something like that. But it's not going to ruin your life in the sense of it's certainly not going to kill you, right? You're not going to die because you failed an exam. You're not going to end up somewhere drastic like in prison for 30 years or something like that. Kitty cat, sweetie. It's simply not going to ruin your life. It might temporarily make your life harder or make your life, you know, not so fun to be living in that moment, but it's not going to ruin the next, you know, you're 18, 19 years old. It's not going to, you failing that exam is going to have zero effect on you when you're 60, is what I'm saying. So you're conflating one small thing into this big disastrous outcome that's going to happen. Another example of this would be that someone, maybe you were trying to argue that the drinking age should be lowered since 18-year-olds can vote and they can serve in the military, they can do these other things. You're making the argument that because of that, the drinking age should be lowered to 18. And someone in response says, well, if we lower the drinking age, then that means that a bunch of kids are going to start going into bars and getting drunk. And when they say kids, they mean like kids, they mean children, like, you know, 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds. When that's not going to happen. That if you lower the drinking age to 18, it's not going to then create a bunch of 10-year-old alcoholics. That's not how that works. So you're taking one small thing and giving it this big negative drastic effect. So it's slippery. You know, you're starting off at one point and then you're just sliding down this slope very quickly and ending up in a bad place. So that would be an example of the slippery slope fallacy. Okay. The next fallacy is called the false dilemma or the either/or fallacy. So this is a fallacy that simplifies a topic or a situation down to only two extreme options, when in fact there are many, many options in a given situation. So it's taking something and forcing it to only have two very drastic options, which are often very extreme options or very opposite options, and pretending that no other options exist. The thing about life and the thing about most situations is that we almost always have multiple options. We almost always have more than one option. Now, you might not have a whole lot more than two or three more than two options. You might not have a whole lot more than 3 or 4 or 5 options or something like that. But typically when you're arguing something complex, right, and most of you are arguing something pretty complex for your research papers, it's not going to come down to you have to do this or you have to do this. There are going to be things in between. That's just simply how it works. Especially if you're able to think critically. You're able to realize that there are more than 2 options in a given situation. That's why a lot of people don't like the fact that we only have 2 major political parties, or people don't like the fact that people are labeled as like pro-life or pro-choice, or people are labeled as pro-gun control or anti-gun control, because a lot of people don't fall into those categories so neatly. They don't fall into just, oh, I'm pro-abortion or I'm anti-gun control. A lot of times there's a lot of nuance behind the reason that people make the decisions that they make, and it's not this extreme, you have to be one or the other. So the false dilemma or the either-or fallacy boils something down to only 2 options, when in reality there are a lot more than 2 options. So a kind of laid back example, I've tried to give like a laid back example and then a more serious example for all of these. But a more laid back example for the false dilemma fallacy is saying, Okay, well, our two options are to order pizza for dinner or have leftovers. It's simply pretty much not true. Because you could go to a grocery store, you could order food from a different place, you could take ingredients that you have in your home and you could make something new, right? I mean, that's a very simplified version of what I'm talking about, but it's limiting everything down to just two options and acting as if those are the only two options when in reality there are more options than just that. Because if you have money to get pizza, then you presumably have money to go somewhere else. You have the ability to have pizza delivered to you, then you probably have the ability to have another kind of cuisine delivered to you. If you have stuff in your house that's leftover food, you probably have stuff in your house to make a brand new meal, or, there are just various options. Or if you have the ability to get a pizza delivered, you probably have the ability to go to a grocery store or to have ingredients delivered to you. So there are more than just these two options. A more serious example, a larger example, would be saying that you either absolutely back the police 110% or you just support crime. Like that's not true. That is not true at all. There are a lot of people who question the police. There are a lot of people who call for there to be less funding for the police. There's a lot of people who call for the police to be better regulated. That does not mean that those people are out here saying we should have, no crime, get rid of all the laws. No, nobody should ever be punished or anything. You're making two extremes out of a situation that is way more complex and nuanced than just those two options. So that's what the false dilemma fallacy is. Okay. Next is the appeal to authority. This one's pretty straightforward. This is just saying, well, an authority figure said something was true or trustworthy, and therefore it is true or trustworthy. Laid back example. Remember earlier in the semester when I tricked like half of y'all or more into voting for Hitler in our fake election? Y'all trusted me because I was the authority figure in the room, and you thought, oh, a professor or a teacher would not lead us astray. A teacher would not try to hoodwink us, and yet I did, right? Not to say that I'm not trustworthy. I am. I was using that as an example of why you shouldn't blindly trust authority. But that's what happens when you say, oh, well, this authority figure said that it is true, or that it is right, or whatever it may be, and therefore it must be right. Another example of this, a more serious example, would be that a lot of people, and some people unfortunately still do believe that COVID was a hoax created by Democrats because Donald Trump at one point said that COVID was a hoax created by Democrats. And so you have somebody saying, well, Trump said it, so it must be true, right? He was the president of the United States. He's the authority figure in the United States. So that's an example. Okay. Hasty generalization is the next one. So this fallacy occurs when someone comes to believe something only after considering one or two things rather than doing sufficient research. Okay, so this means that you've had maybe one or two, maybe three interactions with a given topic or a given situation, and you generalize that every other thing must be that way because you've had one or two instances interacting with this thing. So some examples, a more laid back example would be, I visited Louisiana twice and it was raining both times, so it must rain there all the time. That's all it does. It just rains nonstop in Louisiana. Obviously, it's not true. You're basing that off of two interactions that you've had with a place, and you're making this generalization about the entire place. Not true. Or a more problematic example would be saying something like, oh, there were two black guys that bullied me when I was in high school, so all black men must be bullies. All black men must be mean. Again, not true, right? It's a hasty generalization. And while your experiences are valid, of course, you can't generalize something about an entire demographic of people based on two people that you met at one point. You just can't do that because two people do not represent an entire demographic of people, right? So making these big sweeping generalizations based on not enough evidence, not enough research, not enough interaction. Okay. The next fallacy is slothful induction, which I think is fun to say. Slothful induction. This fallacy is the opposite of hasty generalization. It's the opposite of the one that I just talked about. This happens when there is loads of evidence in your face. You have all kinds of evidence, and you choose to ignore that evidence or to create false or irrelevant evidence, right? So this is a good example, going back to the student paper that we were looking at on Wednesday, where that student was saying, he was giving all these statistics about how vegetarianism is actually better for you, but then he was turning around and saying, but you should eat meat anyway. That's like, you have the evidence staring you in the face, but you're not using that evidence in a way that's relevant, or you're introducing evidence that is not relevant to try to contradict the evidence that you have right in front of you. So some other examples of that, you could argue that you could say unavoidable circumstances have caused me to miss the last 3 weeks of work, when you know good and damn well that you were just hanging out with your friends. You have the evidence right in front of you. You know what you've been doing. You know you've just been blowing work off to go and hang out with your friends, but then you turn around and you make the argument that there were unavoidable circumstances. So, yeah, no, that's not what actually happened. Or more drastically, if you were, say, claiming that someone who has been poisoned, like somebody has been poisoned by another person, there's medical evidence to support this, they've been treated with an antidote that's making them better, there's all this evidence that this person has been poisoned, and you try to claim that this person is just exaggerating to get attention. It's like, despite the fact that you've seen their medical reports, you've seen that the antidote for the given poison is helping them get better, so on and so forth. So that would be you having the evidence right there staring you in the eyes, and you going, no. Yeah, I'm not gonna look at that. This also ties into something that's called confirmation bias, which is not a logical fallacy, but confirmation bias is when it's a human tendency that we all have, in which we seek out information that confirms what we already know to be true, or what we already believe to be true. This is why it's so hard to cross lines of politics, identity, religion, so on and so forth, because we tend to put blinders on and go, oh, that thing over there, that challenges my worldview, I'm not going to look at that thing. So, which is you can't do that. I mean, you can, but you're never going to learn anything if you live your life that way. Ignoring evidence for the sake of ignoring evidence, or for the sake of trying to make your argument, is an example of a logical fallacy, because you're not taking into account the things that are right there in front of you. Okay. The next fallacy is called begging the question, or circular logic. You probably heard the term circular logic before. Pardon me. This happens when logic happens circularly, or by assuming that something is true without giving the reason for its truth. Goes back again to that student paper earlier, where he was making these comments about how, like, vegetarians might be eating more junk food than they are vegetables and fruits. It's like, okay, that could be true, but you could make the same assumption about people who eat meat. It's circular. It comes back on itself. You're assuming something without giving me cause to show why you're assuming that thing. Now, had this student provided evidence, had they said, this study indicated that, I'm just making this up, but had they provided evidence saying, oh, there was a study that showed that 90% of vegetarians don't eat enough fruits and vegetables, and instead they eat things like chips and crackers and cookies and stuff like that. If you give me evidence, that's one thing, but you can't just say something and make the assumption that it's true based on a generalization, or based on your just assumption that it might be true. So it's a circular way of thinking. So a laid back example, I'm sure that all of you have had a parent or a guardian at some point who has done some version of this to you, but when I was a kid, my dad would say, it's time for bed, and I would say, why? And he would say, because it's bedtime. That's circular. You're not answering my question. I'm asking you, why is it time for bed? And you saying because it's bedtime is just circling back to what you've already said. So it's not a real answer to the question that I'm posing. It's not a real justification of the reason that you're giving me this information or making this argument. A larger example, a more serious example, would be to say critical race theory shouldn't be taught in schools because it's dangerous. It's like, why is it dangerous? How is it dangerous? Can you give me evidence to show how critical race theory would be a dangerous thing to introduce into schools? And if you can't do that, circular logic. You're just throwing something out there on the assumption that it's true without actually providing any evidence of its truth. So that is circular logic, or what's also called begging the question. Okay. Next one is appeal to ignorance. So appeal to ignorance, this fallacy claims that something must be true or untrue because it hasn't been proven otherwise. Pretty straightforward. An example of this would be someone saying, well, aliens must exist because nobody has been able to prove that they don't exist. Or God must exist because nobody has been able to prove that God doesn't exist. Or ghosts exist because nobody has been able to prove that they don't exist. It's like, just because you can't prove that it doesn't exist doesn't mean that it does, and vice versa. An atheist would say God isn't real because we haven't been able to prove that God is real. It's like, well, that's not... That doesn't mean anything. Just because you haven't been able to prove that something is real or not real doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't exist, or that it's not real, or that it isn't real, or that it is real. Another example would be more drastically would be that since you can't prove you're innocent, you have to be guilty. It's like, it's not true. That's the whole premise of our court system is, in fact, the opposite of that. It's innocent until proven guilty. And it works the other way around, too. You can be proven guilty and still be innocent, technically. It actually happens a lot. But it's just this claim that because something hasn't been proven, or because something hasn't been unproven, then it must not be what people claim that it is. Appeal to ignorance. Okay. The red herring fallacy. This is another one that you have maybe heard of before. This fallacy happens when a person tries to deflect attention away from the topic at hand onto something that is not related, to move the argument away from where it's at. Politicians, again, you see do this all the time. Advertisers, interestingly, do this a lot of the time as well. So some examples. This would be something that my father would likely say to me. If I said to my father, it's difficult to live on the given minimum wage right now, that it's hard to get by making what the minimum wage is, my dad might retort, well, in the 70s, minimum wage was $3.50 or whatever it was in the 70s. Like that's not relevant to what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is right now, in the current day and age, with what minimum wage is right now, it's difficult to make a living off of that. What happened in the 70s with minimum wage is irrelevant to right now. Unless you're doing a comparison where you're showing that inflation and the cost of living has increased dramatically compared to back then while minimum wage has not increased, that's not relevant to what I'm talking about. You're deflecting the conversation away to something that is different, something that's a different matter. Another example again of where politicians like to do this a lot. So say that a politician is asked what they plan to do about corruption in government. A journalist says, what do you plan to do about corruption in government? That politician might then answer and say, I have many plans to stop corruption in government. I also have a 10-point plan to create more jobs. Let me tell you about that 10-point plan. So the person has said something about corruption in government, but they're not really answering the question. They're deflecting the question into a different direction, and they're moving away from the argument at hand. This is a good strategy to distract people from whatever a given topic is, especially if it's something that you don't want people to think about or know about. Okay. Appeal to tradition. That's similar to the appeal to authority. It just means that you're arguing that something should be upheld or that something is true because it is based in tradition or because it has been done for a long time. Some examples would be claiming that all women should be stay-at-home wives and mothers because traditionally that's what women have done in America or in many other cultures. Like, just because traditionally that's been the way that it is doesn't mean it needs to stay that way. Tradition does not equal rightness, right? Tradition is just that. It's just something that we have traditionally done or something that over time has become the standard. That doesn't mean that it's correct. It doesn't mean that it should be repeated. It doesn't mean that it's inherently truthful. It just means that we've been doing it for a long time and it's become the standard. Another example that's equally damaging probably would be that to say that since traditionally gay marriage was illegal, gay people must be immoral, or that gay marriage in and of itself is immoral. It's like, it's just simply not true. It was just that for a long time, culturally, legally, that's what the country practiced, but that doesn't mean that it should be the standard, nor does it mean that it's something that we should uphold. So appealing to tradition, not good. Not to go back to my father, but that would be a big way that my father would try to excuse some of his actions and some of his beliefs, is that that's what his daddy believed, and his daddy before him, and his daddy before him, and so on and so forth. It's like, that doesn't mean that what you believe now or what your ancestors believed is necessarily a good thing or something that should be upheld. So getting rid of it, or holding on to it rather because of tradition, not a good argument, not logical. Okay, the bandwagon fallacy. I know y'all have heard of this one, especially the sports fans in the room. The bandwagon fallacy concerns arguing that something is right or should be upheld or is factual or what have you because a whole lot of people say it is, or because a whole lot of people participate in that thing. So again, for my sports people in the room, you've all probably used this term at some point. People will say, oh, everybody's jumping on the bandwagon of X team because they won the championship last year, or the only reason that a particular team has so many supporters is because they've always had a whole lot of supporters. I hear that argument a lot about the Cowboys, the Dallas Cowboys. I know nothing about football, so that may or may not be true. But jumping on the bandwagon is that term of like, the only reason that you're doing it now is because so many other people are doing it now. As a logical fallacy, it's a faulty logic, because just because a whole lot of people are doing it or a whole lot of people are enjoying it doesn't mean that it's necessarily a good thing or a true thing, etc. Another kind of more serious way to think about this one would be if somebody justified cheating on their partner because everybody is doing it. If you get caught cheating and your partner says, well, why'd you do this to me? Well, because everybody is doing it. Well, that's not a good reason to cheat on your partner. There's not a good reason to cheat on your partner, but that's a really bad reason to cheat on your partner. So that's an example of the bandwagon, is making something, upholding something or believing in something simply because everybody else is doing it. Okay, the appeal to emotion or argument from passion. So this goes back when we were talking about rhetorical analysis to ethos. To pathos, to emotion. This fallacy concerns trying to manipulate people from an emotional standpoint to believe what you're saying or to get them to back you. Now, sometimes this is relatively innocent. Again, a lot of politicians do this. A lot of advertisers do this. When I say sometimes it's somewhat innocent, what I mean by that is those ASPCA commercials where they show you a bunch of images of starving dogs or, cats that are missing limbs or, neglected animals, whatever, and they play the really sad music and all that. They're trying to get you to feel guilty for the situation that these animals are in, right? They're trying to make you sad. They're trying to get you to feel guilty. They want your money. They want you to donate to their charity. They want you to do these different things. So sometimes it's not necessarily like we're trying to trick you. I mean, they are trying to trick you in a way, but it's not like we're doing this for a deeply malicious reason. But the reason that you should want to help animals that are hurt or animals that have been neglected is not because you feel guilty about the status that they're in, but because it's wrong to be cruel and neglectful towards animals and we should be trying to intervene, right? It shouldn't be because you feel sad about it or that you feel guilty about it. A more serious example, let's see, I'm trying to think, sorry. A more serious example might be something like, say that your partner comes home from work or whatever and says, I've had a really, really bad day, and then they try to coerce you into doing some kind of sexual act that you don't want to do, and they go to you, they come again and they say, well, I've had a really, really bad day. You don't want me to feel bad, do you? Right? You don't want me to feel bad. Just do this thing for me. Like, that's a logical fallacy, and it's also very problematic because you're trying to coerce someone into a sexual act against their will. But it's someone, rather than giving a valid reason or giving a reason backed in evidence or giving a reason that makes sense, rather than trying to do that, they're trying to make you feel something and then react based off of that feeling. So they're trying to get you to have an emotional reaction to something, and then rather than thinking, you act off of your emotions, right? It's very easy to manipulate people if you can get them worked up in one way or another, whether it's you make them sad, you make them fearful, whatever it may be. But if you can get people riled up in one way or another, they're much more likely to act more rationally. They're going to act without thinking as much about what they're doing or about what they're saying. So appealing to emotion can be very dangerous. Not always, but sometimes it is. But anyway, when you're making a research-based argument, which is what we're doing for this class, you got to get away from appealing to emotion. You can't appeal to emotion because you want people to act based on them thinking about what you said, rather than them having some visceral reaction to what you said and becoming angry or becoming upset or becoming worried, so on and so forth. So you want to avoid that. Okay, and then finally, false compromise or middle ground. So this one is less related to research, but I wanted to talk about it a little bit just because it does happen sometimes in research-based writing. So I wanted to talk about it briefly. This happens when two or more people, or one person even, suggests that on behalf of two or more people, come to some kind of compromise that doesn't really solve the problem or the issue at hand, and rather everybody is just agreeing to agree on something and just leave it alone. You could also call this agreeing to disagree, which never really moves conversations forward, right? If you just decide like, okay, look, clearly we're on two different pages. We're never going to think about this in the same way. Let's just stop talking about it. Nobody's walking away really happy or really feeling that the situation was settled, right? So you can do this sometimes in your argumentative writing or your argumentative approaches to things in general. But it's not really a compromise, though. It's a compromise for the sake of compromising rather than an actual compromise. So laid back example would be, I say the sky is blue, you say the sky is pink. We argue for a little while, and then we both go, you know what, let's just agree to say it's purple. Nobody's happy. Neither of us are getting the color that we were arguing for in the first place, and chances are pretty good that the sky isn't purple either, that one of us was wrong, right? So it's not really a compromise to the situation, rather it's a compromise to the two people arguing about the situation that doesn't actually solve the issue or come to a conclusive, understanding. A more serious example of this might be, say that a couple owns a dog. They own a dog, and the dog bites somebody. And one partner wants to give the dog away. They want to get rid of the dog. They want the dog out of the house. The other partner wants to euthanize the dog. The other partner said, no, the dog bit somebody. The dog needs to be put down. And rather than coming to an actual compromise, what they do is they confine the dog to a very small kennel and keep it in their backyard for the rest of its life, where they really neglect it, right? It's not a real compromise because the dog is still in the house, which neither party wanted. The dog is still alive, which one party didn't want. the dog is no longer a part of their household in a real way, and the dog is suffering at that point, right? I'm not making an argument for whether or not a dog should be euthanized if they bite someone, but I will say that no animal deserves to live in a confined spot and be neglected for the entirety of their life. That's just not the good outcome in that situation. This can also happen, like, for example, the student paper that we were looking at earlier, when he gets to his conclusion, he kind of lamely says that vegetarians can continue to be vegetarians and just eat a little bit of meat sometimes, which is not really a good compromise to what because in the first place he was sort of arguing against vegetarian diet and advocating for more meat intake, but he never really prescribes what that meat intake should look like, nor does he prescribe how much is too much. Pardon me. Rather, he kind of comes to this vague, like, oh, still be a vegetarian, but eat meat occasionally. It's like, you're not really compromising with yourself, and you're definitely not compromising with the vegetarians that you are trying to get to stop being vegetarian. So yeah, false compromise. When you're coming to a conclusion, you're coming to a solution that's not really a solution, but rather it's a way to stop the conversation about whatever the given topic is. Okay, those are logical fallacies. I have been talking all day. I'm tired of talking. If you have questions or anything for me, I will be traveling over the weekend. I will be settled by Sunday. But I will be traveling over the weekend, so I may be slow responding to you if you need anything from me. Other than that, don't forget to do your responses, and I'll see you in the next video lecture that I will put up shortly. Bye.